In a world where love and darkness collide, sometimes the heart can see what the mind refuses to accept. Tina has unraveled Tgun's buried humanity, but even as feelings stir between them, shadows of the past continue to loom. Is love enough to break through the walls he's built, or will his world of vengeance consume them both? Tonight, we return to the crossroads of fate. This is not just a story, it's a tale meant for your ears.
As Tina sat in the small guest house, her mind was in turmoil. Idris had just left her with more questions than answers. Could she really help Tgun know Thomas? Could there still be something good left in him, buried beneath the layers of cruelty and bitterness? Her thoughts were interrupted when Idris received a sudden, urgent call. I have to go, Tina. I'll come back soon. Just take your time and think about everything I've told you, he said, hurrying off. Once Idris returned to the mansion, chaos greeted him. Some of their men were laid out on makeshift beds, being tended to by their standby doctor. The scene was a mess of blood, bruises, and tension. Idris' stomach twisted with frustration. What happened here? One of the injured men groaned as he spoke. It was Pistol's boys. They ambushed us during the shipment clearing, but we fought back. Idris cursed under his breath. Pistol had been a thorn in their side for too long. He had been one of Dawn's most loyal men and was furious when Dawn passed his empire to Tgun instead of him. Ever since, Pistol had become their biggest rival, always trying to sabotage their operations and reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. Where's Tgun? Idris asked, shaking with a mix of anger and concern. In his study, a guard replied. Driss headed to the study, where he found Tgun seated with a drink in his hand, his face calm, yet etched with anger. Where the hell were you? Tgun's voice was low, dangerous. Idris opened his mouth, but Tgun cut him off sharply. How could you leave something so important for the boys to handle? Look what your carelessness has cost us. His voice was tense, and Idris felt the sting in every word. Tgun leaned back, coldly calm, but clearly agitated. Clean up this mess, he ordered. Later that night, when Idris returned to report that everything had been handled, Tgun seemed calmer but still on edge. Idris finally asked, why aren't we confronting Pistol? You're not scared of him. So why hold back? Tgun's response was blunt. He's like a brother. I won't fight him. Idris shook his head. Pistol doesn't see you as a brother anymore. He turned to leave, but Tgun suddenly spoke again. Where were you earlier? Idris hesitated. At the guest house, seeing Tina. The mention of her name made Tgun's heart flip. Before he could control himself, he blurted, How is she? Idris, shocked at the question, smirked slightly but tried to keep his face neutral. She's fine, he said, enjoying the moment. But she won't be here long. She plans to leave the city soon. Tgun stiffened, surprised by his own reaction. Where's she going? I thought you said she had no relatives, he said, trying to hide his concern behind a nonchalant tone. Idris couldn't hide his amusement. You made her believe her only family was dead, remember? So now, she feels there's nothing left for her here. Tgun fell silent, waving Idris off. But that night, Tgun couldn't sleep. The thought of Tina leaving haunted him. What if he never saw her again? The next morning, Tina, filled with confusion and anger after her conversation with Idris, called the number he had given her. Her heart pounded as she waited for someone to pick up. Hello. Her uncle's voice echoed through the line, and she couldn't believe it. He was alive. Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to him explain how he had fled that night, running from Tgun's wrath. He apologized, begged her forgiveness for leaving her alone. Where are you? I need to see you, she pleaded. I can't, Tina. It's not safe for either of us. Please, just live your life. When the time is right, I'll come for you. They cried together over the phone before ending the call. Tina was torn apart. She hated Tgun even more now. He had made her believe her uncle was dead, keeping her as his prisoner for his twisted revenge. But she wasn't going to leave the city anymore. Her uncle told her to stay and live her life, and she would. She'd find a job and start over. Meanwhile, Tgun, still unable to shake the thought of Tina leaving, ordered a sudden inspection of the guest house, taking his men by surprise. Normally, Tgun never bothered with these inspections himself, but Idris knew exactly why he was so keen on this visit. When they arrived at the guest house, Tgun's heart raced. He prayed he'd see her, just one glimpse. As luck would have it, Tina was leaving the house, on her way to search for a job. Idris waved at her, and she waved back with a small smile. But Tgun was frozen, staring at her, unable to speak. She turned to walk away, and he blurted out, "When are you leaving?"
Tina looked at him, confused.
"What are you talking about?" "I heard you're leaving the city." "When are you going?" he pressed, trying to mask his desperation. Tina rolled her eyes. "How is that your business? I'm not your prisoner anymore." Tgun forced a smile. "I see no one told you. I have new guests coming, and you're occupying space." Tina's eyes narrowed as she turned to Idris, who raised his eyebrows, equally confused by Tgun's sudden lie. "I'm staying," she declared. "I'm not going anywhere until I've found a job and saved enough to leave." Relief washed over Tgun, though he masked it poorly. "Fine," he muttered, before abruptly calling off the inspection. His men, who had been preparing for a thorough check of the premises, exchanged confused looks. They hadn't even started when Tgun suddenly said, "We're done here." On the way back, Tgun couldn't stop smiling, much to Idris' amusement. Tgun's strange happiness didn't go unnoticed by the men, who were both puzzled and quietly entertained by their boss' unusual behavior. Tina had managed to secure a job at a laundromat, and despite the challenges, she was beginning to piece her life back together. The routine of work helped distract her from the chaos that had consumed her since the night she first crossed paths with Tgun. She was determined to move on and leave the past behind. When Idris came by the guest house to visit again, she greeted him with a tired but genuine smile. "I got the job," she said. Idris' face lit up with relief. "That's great. So, does this mean you're staying?" Tina hesitated before answering, her eyes flickering with a mixture of emotions. "I'm staying for now, but not because of Tgun," she added quickly, her voice firm. "I don't want anything to do with him." "This has nothing to do with him." Idris' smile faded slightly. He knew Tina was still hurting, still struggling to make sense of everything. "I understand," he said quietly. "But just so you know, he's not the man you think he is." Tina sighed. "I don't care what kind of man he is. He took everything from me. My home, my family. I just want to live my life without being haunted by him." She paused, her tone softening. "I appreciate your kindness, Idris. You've been a good friend. But I'll be leaving the guest house soon. My boss at the laundromat has a room for rent, and I'm going to move in there." Idris nodded, though the weight of her words stung. He had hoped that over time, she might see Tgun in a different light, but her pain was too deep. Still, he respected her decision. As much as Idris wanted to push back, he knew this wasn't the time. "If that's what you need," he said, trying to hide his disappointment. "But if you ever change your mind—" "I won't," she replied firmly, her eyes locking with his. "I won't let him control my life anymore." Meanwhile, at the casino, Pistol, Tgun's longtime enemy, made his next move, this time targeting one of Tgun's biggest assets, his casino. The attack came without warning, and the damage was severe. Several of Tgun's men were wounded in the firefight, and the retaliation was swift. Back at the mansion, Idris stormed into Tgun's study, his frustration boiling over. "We can't keep letting Pistol get away with this. He's making us look weak," Idris said, pacing the room. Tgun sat behind his desk, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed a simmering rage. "We retaliate. Now," he said coldly. The retaliation was brutal. Tgun's men attacked Pistol's operations with precision. Amidst the chaotic exchange of gunfire, Tgun and Pistol found themselves crouched behind the wreckage of overturned furniture, using the heavy pieces as cover. The air was thick with tension as they fired at each other from their hiding spots. Tgun, breathing heavily, called out, "You know we don't have to do this." Pistol let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You've got it all wrong, Tgun. We're not brothers. You never were family." He paused, anger lacing his voice. "I stood by Dawn's side long before you ever showed up, and everything should have been mine. But you came in and took it all." Tgun laughed back, mocking. "That's because I was better than you, Pistol. That's why Dawn trusted me with the Empire." A surge of rage twisted across Pistol's face. "You're just a fool," Pistol shouted. "You worked for the man who killed your father, and called him your father. How pathetic." Tgun froze, confusion clouding his face. Slowly, he rose from behind the cover. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Pistol emerged from his hiding spot as well, meeting Tgun's gaze head-on. "You heard me. It wasn't some random robbery that killed your father. It was Dawn. He ordered the hit, and I was the one who pulled the trigger. Dawn knew that as long as your father was alive, you'd never truly belong to him." Tgun's body went rigid, the weight of Pistol's revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. For a moment, it felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath his feet. But before he could fully process it, Pistol aimed his gun, fury driving him as he shouted, "And now, I'll end you just like I ended him." A shot rang out, and Tgun collapsed, clutching his leg as pain seared through him. Pistol moved to finish the job, but before he could pull the trigger, Idris appeared from the shadows, firing a precise shot that knocked the gun from Pistol's hand. With swift action, Idris rushed to Tgun's side, pulling him to safety. But even as they made their escape, Idris couldn't understand why his usually sharp and ruthless friend had been vulnerable enough to be caught off guard, until he saw the haunted look in Tgun's eyes. The revelation had shaken him to his core. Tgun locked himself in his room after the confrontation with Pistol, drowning in the sorrow of what he had just learned. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The weight of the revelation, that Dawn had orchestrated his father's death, crushed him with guilt. He replayed the events over and over in his mind. If only he hadn't gone back to Dawn, if only he had listened to his father. The regret was eating him alive. His men noticed the shift, and for the first time, they saw their ruthless leader broken. Idris, too, was terrified for his friend, but had no idea how to help. The mansion had never felt so quiet, and everyone was on edge. It was in this tense atmosphere that Idris received a call from Tina. She thanked him for all his help and informed him she'd be moving out to her new apartment. In his distress, Idris mentioned Gun's condition, not expecting much. But to his surprise, Tina's voice changed. Without fully understanding why she was so concerned, she decided to visit the mansion. Tina knocked on the door, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed her forehead against it. The heavy silence from inside weighed on her chest. "It's me, Tina," she whispered. No answer. She knocked again, her voice shaking now. "Tgun, please just let me talk to you." From inside, his voice came out low and cold. "Leave." Tina clenched her fists, refusing to move. "I'm not going anywhere." A harsh silence followed, and her heart pounded in her ears. She sat down outside the door, leaning her back against it, closing her eyes as tears burned behind her eyelids. "I know what you're feeling right now. It feels like the world is crushing you, like you can't breathe. I've felt that way too." Still no answer, but she could sense he was listening. "My parents, they died when I was just a kid," she said, her voice breaking as memories flooded her. "It was my fault, or at least I believed it was. I was playing with this red balloon in the back seat, laughing, not paying attention. My mom kept telling me to stop, but I didn't listen. I was just a kid, I didn't think." Her breath hitched, and a tear slid down her cheek. It slipped out of my hand, floated right in front of my dad's face. He tried to bat it away, but in that split second, her voice broke into a sob, and she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying too loudly. They lost control of the car, it flipped. I woke up and they didn't. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I killed them, Tgun. I thought it was all my fault. Inside the room, Tgun had frozen. His hands, which had been trembling in rage and sorrow moments before, now lay still, limp by his sides as he stared at the floor. Tina continued, her voice raw. For years, I couldn't breathe under the weight of it. I didn't want to eat, didn't want to live. The guilt, it was unbearable. I wanted to disappear. Her words hung heavy in the air, sinking into Tgun's heart. How did you survive it? His voice was so soft, it barely made it past the door. Tina took a deep, shuddering breath. I didn't survive it, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. But I learned I had to forgive myself. Even if I didn't think I deserved it, I had to live with it every single day. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then, from behind the door, Tgun's voice broke, full of pain. I don't know if I can forgive myself. Not for what I did. Not for what I caused. Tina felt her heart shatter at the sound of his voice. She pressed her hand against the door, wishing she could take his pain away. You can, she whispered. You just have to try. No one's asking you to forget, but you don't have to carry this alone forever. For the first time in years, Tgun felt tears fall from his eyes. Silent sobs racked his chest, and though Tina couldn't see him, she knew. I'm not ready, he choked out. You don't have to be ready all at once, Tina replied gently. But take the first step. Just forgive yourself for one thing. Even if it's small, that's how you start. He didn't respond, but she didn't push. She sat there, outside the door, waiting, giving him the space to feel. Eventually, she stood up. I'll be here when you're ready, she whispered, and quietly left. Tgun stayed still, his body trembling with sobs, but as he wiped the tears away, he knew she had left something behind. Hope. As Tina quietly left the mansion, her emotions churned like a storm inside her. She tried to walk quickly, desperate to escape the heavy air that clung to her after seeing Tgun in such a broken state. Yet, the more she hurried, the more her steps faltered. Tears welled up, her chest tightening. Why had she gone to see him? Why did she even care after all he had put her through? She wiped at her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. All the times she had cursed his name, the way she had vowed to never feel anything but hatred for him, played in her mind. And now here she was torn to pieces because seeing him like that had ripped open something inside her. Am I going mad? She whispered to herself, leaning against a wall for support, her heart pounding. He kept me prisoner, burned down my home. He's responsible for so much pain. But then she remembered the way his voice cracked when he admitted he couldn't forgive himself. His tears. The vulnerable man behind the mask of the ruthless Tgun. And in that moment, Tina felt her walls crumbling. I should hate him. I should hate him. The words trembled on her lips. But deep down, she couldn't ignore what was burning at her core. The truth she had fought so hard to deny. Love. She gasped, her breath catching as the realization hit her fully. How could she love him? How could her heart betray her like this, after everything? But it was too late. There it was, lodged deep inside her like a thorn she couldn't remove. All the time she spent thinking about him, trying to understand him, it wasn't just out of curiosity or even revenge. I love him, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground. How is this even possible? He was the one who destroyed her world. Yet, the very man she thought she despised had somehow found his way into her heart. The pain of the truth was unbearable. She let the tears flow freely now, sobbing quietly, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of her own emotions. When Idris came out, he found her like that, crying, clutching her knees. His expression softened, and he approached her cautiously. He didn't need to ask why. He already knew the answer that even Tina had struggled to admit. Thank you for coming, he said gently. You don't know how much you've helped him tonight. Tina wiped her face, standing shakily. I didn't do it for him, she whispered, more to herself than to Idris, trying to maintain her resolve. But as she walked away, she knew deep down that was a lie. She had done it for him. The days after Tina left the mansion felt heavier than ever. She hadn't expected to feel anything for Tgun, especially not after everything he'd done. But after seeing him break down, hearing his pain, and witnessing his vulnerability, she couldn't shake the truth. She cared about him. She tried to fight it. She threw herself into her new job at the laundromat, telling herself that she only pitied him. It was not love. Tina sighed heavily as she folded another shirt, the noise of the laundromat fading into the background. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him. At the mansion, Tgun's guilt consumed him. He hadn't been the same since that night with Tina. Her words, her compassion, cut through his armor in ways he hadn't expected. But instead of feeling relief, the guilt of his past weighed heavier on his shoulders. The truth about his father's death haunted him. How could he live with himself, knowing Dawn had orchestrated it? Every decision, every step he had taken since that day was built on a lie. His empire, his power, it all felt hollow. He couldn't bear it anymore. His whole life had been built on pain, and now it felt like the weight of that pain was too much to carry. The room felt suffocating, his chest tightening with every breath. He looked at the gun on the desk, his hand trembling as he reached for it. Maybe this was the only way to end the endless torment. He pressed the cold metal to his temple, his thoughts spiraling. This is how it ends. But just as his finger hovered over the trigger, Idris burst in, his eyes wide with fear. "No," Idris shouted, rushing forward and knocking the gun out of his hand. The gun clattered to the floor as Idris grabbed him by the shoulders. "Tgun, what are you doing?" Tgun's eyes were glazed, distant. "I can't do this anymore, Idris. I don't know who I am. I don't know how to live like this." Idris held him tight, his voice shaking with emotion. "You are not alone in this. You don't have to go through this alone. Please don't leave us." Tina was in her apartment when the call came. Idris, his voice frantic, told her everything. Tgun's attempted suicide, his breakdown, and how he was spiraling into darkness. Tina's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe for a moment as the words sank in. Her body moved on instinct, rushing out the door. She didn't stop to think, she couldn't. The thought of Tgun dying, of never seeing him again, sent a wave of panic through her that she didn't understand. When she arrived at the mansion, Idris met her, his face etched with worry. "He's in bad shape. He needs you." Tina's breath caught in her throat, and without another word, she made her way to his room. Her heart in her throat. She knocked softly. "Tgun, it's me. Please let me in." There was no response. "Tgun, I know how you feel. I know what it's like to feel responsible for something horrible, to feel like you don't deserve to live." Her voice trembled, tears filling her eyes. "But you don't have to carry that alone. You don't have to suffer like this." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, she tried to open the door, but he stepped closer, holding the doorknob. With a broken voice, he said, "Please leave." And in that moment, she realized she couldn't leave him. Not like this. She stepped closer and whispered, "I can't let you go, Tgun." "Not now." Tgun yelled, his voice breaking, "I don't deserve you, pity Tina. You're better off without me. I'm not someone you need. I'm a monster." He turned his back to the door, his fists clenched in frustration. "Please leave me alone." Tina felt the words pierce her heart, tears brimming in her eyes. She couldn't bear to see him like this, broken, vulnerable, and pushing her away. "I don't pity you, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling but firm. I love you." Tgun spun around, his eyes wide in disbelief. He laughed, but it wasn't a joyful sound. It was bitter, sharp. "You don't know what you're saying." "Love me? You can't be serious." "Let me in," Tina demanded, stepping closer. "Or I swear, I'll break this door down." She pushed against it, her desperation evident in her every move. For a moment, there was a struggle between them, her pulling, him resisting, until he finally gave in. He opened the door, and she stumbled into his arms. Their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling. Tgun's hand rested on her back as she pressed against him. In a moment of weakness, they leaned closer, their lips almost touching, but at the last second, Tgun pulled away, his heart pounding. "You're crazy," he said, shaking his head. "Why would you love someone like me?" Tina's eyes softened, but her resolve was unshaken. "Maybe I am crazy," she whispered, "but I do love you. And why can't I?" Tgun grabbed her arms, his grip firm but not harsh. His voice rose, trembling with pain. "Because I can't be loved. Not after everything I've done.
I'm not worthy of it."
Tina, eyes wet with tears but shining with defiance, yelled back. "That's a lie, Thomas. You think you're beyond saving, but you're not. You deserve to be loved. You just won't let yourself believe it." They stood there, both breathing heavily, emotions raw and exposed. Tgun's voice broke as he yelled, "Have you forgotten everything I did to you, Tina? Every cruel thing." His eyes were wild with anguish, the memories of his wrongs tearing him apart inside. Tina shook her head slowly, stepping closer. "No, Thomas, I haven't forgotten. But I still love you, despite it all." Her voice was soft, but every word struck like thunder in the silence. He turned his back to her, shaking his head. "I can't even forgive myself. How can you?" His voice trembled, his hands clenched into fists. "Because I love you," she said firmly, stepping toward him, refusing to let him walk away from the truth of her feelings. Tgun tried to move, retreating from her, his heart torn between shame and desire, but Tina grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward her. She cupped his face gently with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Thomas, look at me," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "I love you." His lips parted, as if he was about to protest, to push her away with more words of doubt. But before he could say anything, she leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was slow, passionate, filled with all the emotions neither had dared to speak before. Tears rolled down both their cheeks as they held onto each other, their hearts breaking and mending in the same breath. That night, they gave in to the longing that had been building between them for so long, their passion undeniable. By morning, they both lay in the soft light, not quite believing what had happened but unable to deny the love that had finally surfaced. Tgun looked at her as she slept peacefully beside him, a storm of emotions swirling within him. He wondered how she could love him, of all people, a man burdened by guilt and violence. He felt unworthy of her love or forgiveness. After the intense night they shared, Tgun woke early, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on his mind. Tina slept peacefully beside him, her face serene. He couldn't understand how someone like her could love someone like him. The guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't help watching her sleep, the softness of her breath grounding him in a way he hadn't felt before. Quietly, he slipped out of bed. When he stepped out of the room, Idris was waiting for him, an amused smile tugging at his lips. "So," Idris teased, "is this you finally admitting you're capable of love?" Tgun shot him a sharp look, but sighed. "Do you really think it's right? For me, after everything?" Idris softened, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Tgun, you deserve to love and be loved. Don't let your past, or your guilt, hold you back. Tina's love isn't something to run from." Tgun nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. "I don't know, Idris." Feeling the need to do something special for her, he ordered breakfast for Tina, a gesture that surprised Idris and the kitchen staff. Tgun had never been one to care about such things, but today he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. He instructed the chef to prepare something nice, something different from the usual meals in the mansion. Idris noticed the effort, smiling knowingly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about what was happening inside Tgun's hardened heart. When breakfast was ready, Idris couldn't help but grin as he watched Tgun quietly arrange it on the table himself. "You're really trying, aren't you?" Idris teased, but Tgun shot him a look that shut down the banter. The tension about Pistol and the unfinished business was still looming in Tgun's mind. Later, Tina woke and joined them at the table. She smiled softly at Tgun's effort, her heart warming at the sight of the breakfast he had arranged. But as they ate, she overheard Tgun and Idris talking about their upcoming operation against Pistol. Her smile faded, realizing Tgun was still consumed by his desire for revenge. At the table, Tina's voice was soft, almost pleading. "Thomas, fighting, spilling more blood, it won't heal you." His expression darkened instantly, the warmth from earlier gone in a flash. "Are you trying to change me, Tina?" His voice was cold, cutting. "This is my world, an eye for an eye. I told you this can't work." Tina's heart ached as she saw the walls go back up, the vulnerability from the night before disappearing. She stood abruptly, her eyes burning with hurt. "Then maybe you're right. I must be crazy to love you. And maybe what happened yesterday was a mistake." Her voice trembled as she turned and left, her heart heavy with both love and despair. Conflicted and torn, Idris, seeing the look on his friend's face, stayed silent, knowing this was a battle Tgun had to fight within himself. As Tina walks away, her heart heavy with disappointment, Tgun stares after her, his world tilting. Torn between the man he was raised to be and the man she believes he could become, a storm brews inside him. But while he battles his demons, an even greater threat lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike. Will Tgun let love lead him into the light, or will vengeance drag him deeper into darkness? The choice is his, but time is running out. Thank you for watching.
Till next time.